Ever catch yourself doing something just because, well, everyone else is?
Hmm.
Maybe automatically clapping after a presentation or even agreeing with a suggestion in a group, even if a little voice inside is saying
Oh,
otherwise.
yeah, we've all felt that subtle pull, you know, to go along with the crowd.
Absolutely. So today we're plunging into the fascinating realm of these unseen influences.
These silent architects.
Exactly, the ones that really shape how we think and act.
We're talking about social norms, those often unspoken rules that, well, guide our beliefs, our behaviors, how we interact.
They're the standards, right? What's considered acceptable in a group or society?
Precisely. And what's really interesting is how deeply these norms can affect us, often without us even realizing it.
Totally. And to really get our minds around this intriguing subject, we've got a fantastic resource.
Ah, yes, the article.
The Unseen Architects, How Social Norms Shape Our Behavior by Self-Sensei. It provides a great foundation exploring the different kinds of norms.
How we learn them, their impact, even how they change over time. It's quite comprehensive.
It really is.
What this article really highlights is just how widespread these norms are. They
Mm.
influence, everything.
From daily routines, like how we eat or dress.
And major life decisions, and
Yeah.
even our fundamental ideas of, right and wrong.
Right.
So understanding them offers a real shortcut, almost,
Yeah.
to grasping why we and others behave the way we do.
Absolutely. Think of it as gaining like a hidden key to understanding social situations.
Uh-huh. Moments, maybe.
Yeah. So our mission today is to unpack these core ideas, reveal some surprising ways norms influence us.
And explore the fact that these architects, well, they have a rather complex design. It's not all straightforward.
Definitely not.
So, to begin, it's helpful to organize these unseen rules a bit.
Makes sense.
The article outlines 4 main types of social norms: folkways, mores, taboos, and laws.
Okay.
And this isn't just a random list. It's actually a hierarchy. It reflects what a society values and how seriously it views violations.
Yeah. Got it. Okay, let's start unpacking folkways then. What kind of rules fall into this category?
Folkways are essentially the simple, everyday customs, conventions we learn, often without even thinking about it.
Just through repetition, daily interactions.
Exactly. Think of them as the basic etiquette of daily life. These seemingly minor customs are kind of the oil that keeps social interactions running smoothly.
Right, preventing friction even in brief encounters. Give us some examples, those things we just do automatically.
Sure. Waiting in line is a classic folkway.
Oh, yeah.
Dressing in a way that's generally accepted for, say, a casual get-together versus something more formal.
Mm-hmm.
Raising your hand to speak in a meeting, covering your mouth when you yawn,
Simple things.
even just saying thank you when someone does something for you. These are all generally understood, generally followed.
Right, and what happens if you, I don't know, break a folkway? It's not exactly a major offense, is it?
Not at all. The consequences, the sanctions, are usually pretty mild. Maybe a raised eyebrow, perhaps being seen as a little impolite or strange. Or, as the article humorously puts it, you just might not make friends.
Huh, okay,
There's no real moral judgment attached to violating a folkway. It's just odd.
got it. So next up are mores. These sound a bit more significant.
They are. Mores are stricter. They're the social norms that dictate what's considered moral and ethical behavior.
So distinguishing right from wrong within a society.
Precisely. Mores highlight what a society collectively deems important for its moral fabric.
So observing these gives you insight into a culture's core values.
Definitely. A deep understanding, potentially.
So what kind of behaviors fall under the umbrella of mores?
Beliefs that actions like racism and sexism are fundamentally wrong, those are good examples.
Okay.
Prohibitions against behaviors like betraying a confidence, maybe gossiping maliciously, or just the general societal expectations we have around honesty, trustworthiness.
Things with more weight.
Right. Mores often have strong connections to religious or ethical principles.
And the consequences for going against a more serious than just being seen as a bit odd.
Definitely. Violations of mores typically lead to social disapproval. You might find yourself excluded, judged as immoral.
Because they touch on fundamental values.
Exactly. The stakes are higher because these norms touch on values a society holds dear.
Okay, so we've moved from everyday politeness to moral guidelines. Now we have taboos. These sound like the really powerful, deeply ingrained norms.
Exactly. Taboos are very strong, deeply ingrained negative norms. They prohibit behaviors considered repulsive, disgusting, or profoundly offensive.
And violating one triggers intense reactions,
Yeah.
disgust, revulsion.
Yes. And what's interesting is how these deeply ingrained reactions often bypass rational thought. It's almost visceral.
What kind of actions are we talking about with taboos?
Well, widespread taboos include things like incest and cannibalism.
Okay, those are pretty extreme.
They are. Then there can be taboos that are specific to certain cultures, like the prohibition against eating certain meats in some religions or communities.
Right.
Or, in many societies, strong negative views on infidelity, sometimes rising to the level of taboo.
And the consequences for breaking a taboo, I imagine they're quite severe.
They are, often leading to extreme social shame, severe exclusion from the community,
Being cast out.
potentially even being considered an outcast from society altogether. And what's also fascinating about taboos is that they're often unspoken.
Unspoken.
The very act of discussing them can sometimes be seen as a transgression in itself.
That's a powerful idea. All right, the last category is laws. We all have some familiarity with these. How do they fit into this spectrum?
Laws are essentially social norms that have been formally written down, codified.
At the state or federal level?
Right. They're defined by governing bodies as either permissible or prohibited,
Yeah.
and they're enforced by agents of the state.
Like law enforcement, the courts.
Exactly.
So things like laws against theft or violence, traffic regulations.
Precisely. Laws often aim to discourage behaviors that would cause harm, infringe upon rights, or disrupt public order. They represent the most formal level in our hierarchy.
With violations leading to legally defined consequences.
Fines, imprisonment, things like that. Yes.
So these four categories, folkways, mores, taboos, laws, give us a useful way to think about social rules. But the article points out that these categories aren't always rigid.
That's a key point. There's often overlap.
How so?
Well, take an act like murder. It clearly violates it's seen as deeply immoral,
Right.
but it's also considered a taboo in most societies.
And obviously illegal.
And, of course, a crime with severe legal repercussions, so it fits into multiple categories.
And it's also important to remember that these norms aren't fixed, right? They change.
Absolutely. Social norms are dynamic, they evolve over time, and they vary considerably between different cultures.
And laws can interact with the other types.
Yes, laws can formalize existing mores and taboos, giving them legal backing.
But they can also be used to change norms.
They can. Laws can be a tool for actively shaping new norms or changing existing ones. Think about anti-discrimination laws, for example,
Right.
or environmental regulations. They were often introduced partly to shift societal behaviors and, over time, influence what's considered acceptable.
That makes sense. So how do we even learn all these different kinds of norms? It seems like a pretty complex system to navigate.
It is, and the process is called socialization.
Socialization.
That's the lifelong journey through which we acquire the knowledge, the values, the behaviors, and the social norms necessary to function in our society.
How we become part of the culture.
Essentially, yes. How we learn the script, you could say.
Lifelong, huh? So it's not just something that happens when you're young.
Not at all. Socialization begins in early childhood, for sure, but it continues throughout our lives.
As we encounter new situations, new roles.
Exactly. New social environments, different roles, evolving expectations. It's essential for us as individuals, helping us understand ourselves and our place.
And for society, too. Ensuring continuity.
Yes, ensuring its continuity by passing down cultural knowledge to new generations.
The article talks about agents of socialization. Who are these key players that teach us the social script?
Well, the first and arguably most influential agent is the family.
Makes sense.
They teach us fundamental skills, our initial understanding of the world, and transmit values related to things like social standing, ethnic background, religion.
And then others come into play.
Then, as we grow, peer groups become increasingly significant, especially during adolescence.
The teenage years.
Right. They teach us about cooperation, social etiquette within our age group, and play a vital role in shaping our identity and sense of independence.
What about more formal settings like school?
School is a crucial formal institution. It obviously teaches academic subjects,
3 R's.
but it also imparts what's known as the hidden curriculum of social behaviors.
Hidden curriculum. Like what?
Things like teamwork, following schedules, understanding societal values like citizenship. Teachers often reinforce those everyday folkways within the school environment too.
Okay. And later in life?
Later in life, the workplace socializes us into the specific norms of our profession, both the practical skills and workplace conduct, the culture of the place.
And what about broader influences like media?
Religion can be a powerful agent, teaching how to engage with religious practices and often upholding specific norms, including those around, say, gender roles.
Mm.
Government establishes and enforces age-related norms through laws,
Mm.
like driving age, voting age.
Right.
And then we have the mass media, TV, the internet, social media, which distributes information widely and influences our norms related to everything from consumerism to lifestyle choices. It's pervasive.
It sounds like we're constantly surrounded by these forces teaching us the norms. But is it always a one-way street? Do we just passively absorb these rules?
That's a great point. And no, it's not always passive.
So we push back or question things.
Well, while these agents primarily transmit existing norms, they can also be places where norms are questioned or reinterpreted. As we interact with different agents, we might encounter conflicting expectations.
Like disagreeing with family rules.
Adolescence, as you mentioned, is a classic period where peer group norms can challenge family norms as individuals seek more autonomy.
Right.
So it's not just passive learning, it involves active interpretation and negotiation. And that can lead to subtle shifts that, over time, contribute to broader changes in social norms.
Okay, so we learn the rules from the outside through socialization, but how do these external rules actually become part of who we are? The article mentions norm internalization.
Internalization.
Yeah.
This is the crucial process where external rules and expectations become internal guides.
So we adopt them, make them our own.
We adopt these normative beliefs and integrate them into our own value system, essentially making them part of our personal sense of right and wrong. It's how societal rules become our own internal compass.
How does that switch happen? How do we go from, I should do this because someone told me to I do this because it feels like the right thing to do?
Well, there are several things at play. We internally reason about our past actions. We observe what others typically do.
Those are descriptive norms.
Right, what people actually do. And we also observe what is generally approved or disapproved of.
Injunctive norms.
Exactly. Our own sense of self based on our choices, feedback we get related to our goals, even our natural desire to have consistent beliefs, these all contribute.
So once a norm is internalized,
It can guide our behavior even when no one else is around. It becomes almost like a habit or even a personal conviction, a personal goal.
the article mentions Kelman's social influence theory here. What's the key idea?
Kelman identified internalization as the deepest level of accepting social influence.
Deeper than just going along.
Much deeper. It occurs when the behavior or belief aligns with our own personal values, beliefs, and attitudes. And crucially, when we see the source of the norm as trustworthy, as credible.
So we adopt the norm because it genuinely resonates with us.
Essentially, yes, because it resonates with what we already believe is correct, rather than just due to external pressure or wanting to fit in superficially.
So if you think about a belief you hold deeply,
Chances are, you didn't just adopt it passively, it likely connected with your existing values. That's what Kelman's theory highlights.
so it's not always just about blindly following what everyone else does. Sometimes these norms really click with our own internal framework.
Exactly. While some might view internalization as simply deep-seated conformity, Kelman's theory emphasizes a more active process. We evaluate and adopt norms that align with our existing moral and value systems.
For them to really take root, they need to connect.
They often need to connect with something already inside us.
Yes. This is all incredibly insightful. Now let's talk about the power of the group. The article discusses conformity, compliance, and identification. These sound like different ways we align ourselves with others.
They are. Conformity, in general terms, is aligning our behaviors, our attitudes, our beliefs with the norms we perceive to be held by a group.
Can be subtle or direct pressure.
It can be a subtle, unconscious process or a direct response to social pressure. A major driving force is our fundamental need for safety, acceptance, and avoiding rejection.
We want to belong.
Deep down, yes. And we often adhere to norms even when we're alone, which shows how deeply ingrained they can become. From a societal perspective, conformity plays a crucial role in maintaining social order.
Okay, so compliance, identification, and internalization. These are different levels of this alignment, right? Based on Kelman's work again.
Precisely. Compliance is the most superficial level.
How so?
We publicly go along with a request or a norm to gain a reward or avoid a punishment. But privately, we might still disagree.
So it's driven by consequences. Power dynamics.
Yes, the anticipated social consequences and the power someone else holds over us. For example, think about following workplace rules you might not personally agree with just to keep your job. That's often compliance.
And being watched increases it.
Surveillance often increases compliance, yes.
Okay. And identification.
Identification is a step deeper. We adopt the attitudes or behaviors of someone we admire or a group we want to be associated with.
To establish a connection or maintain one.
Exactly. The motivation here is the attractiveness of the source, the person or group, and our desire to fulfill certain social roles associated with them. It's more about wanting to be like them.
Like adopting the style of a group you admire.
Thinking about adopting the slang or fashion of a group of friends you admire, that's often identification at work.
And internalization, as we've discussed, is the deepest level.
Yes. We accept a belief or behavior both publicly and privately because it aligns with our own values and beliefs.
Driven by internal reward, trustworthiness.
Driven by that internal reward and the perceived credibility, the trustworthiness of the source. Once internalized, it becomes self-sustaining, part of who you are.
So it's a spectrum, really, from just going along to avoid trouble
To wanting to be like someone.
to truly believing it ourselves.
Exactly. And these levels represent different degrees of how much thought we put into it, cognitive engagement, and how stable that conformity is likely to be.
Compliance might vanish if the situation changes.
It might disappear if the possibility of reward or punishment changes, whereas internalization is much more enduring.
What factors influence how much we tend to conform? It can't be the same for everyone in every situation, surely.
Absolutely not. There are factors related to the group itself.
Like what?
Generally, the pressure to conform increases as the size of the majority increases, but interestingly, only up to a certain point.
Okay.
Unanimity is really important. If even one person expresses a different view, a dissenting opinion,
It breaks the spell.
it significantly reduces the pressure on others to conform. Having an ally makes a big difference.
Oh, also about the group.
Groups that are more cohesive, where members have strong bonds, tend to see more conformity. We want to maintain those relationships.
And status matters.
Yes, we're also more likely to conform to the norms of groups or individuals we perceive to have higher status.
What about the situation itself? Surely that plays a big role.
Definitely. Whether our opinion or behavior is public or private matters a lot.
More conformity in public.
We tend to conform more when we know our actions are visible to others. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Also, if we've already made a public commitment to a certain stance, we're less likely to backtrack and conform later on. We want to seem consistent.
And the task itself?
Even the task characteristics play a role. If a situation is unclear or ambiguous, or a task is difficult, we're more likely to look to the group for guidance. We rely on others more.
The article touches on groupthink as a really negative outcome of conformity taken too far. What's the danger there?
Groupthink. It's what happens in groups that are very close-knit, highly cohesive, when the desire to agree becomes so powerful that it overrides any realistic evaluation of other options.
So harmony becomes more important than being right.
Essentially, yes. It's characterized by a kind of self-deception, illusions of invulnerability, and the active suppression of dissenting opinions. This can lead to really flawed and potentially disastrous decisions.
So the very things that make a group strong, cohesion, agreement, can backfire.
When taken to an extreme, absolutely. They can lead to this irrationality in decision-making.
And then there's obedience to authority, which is a bit different from just conforming to what our peers are doing.
It is distinct. Obedience is specifically following instructions or orders from someone we recognize as a legitimate authority figure.
Like in the Milgram experiments.
That's the classic example, yes. It's distinct from both compliance, which can be to anyone with power, and general conformity to group norms. As those studies showed, authority figures can have a very strong influence.
Sometimes leading people to act against their own judgment.
Yes, sometimes leading people to act in ways that go against their own personal judgment or conscience. It can have negative consequences, clearly.
But positive ones too.
But also positive ones in situations like emergencies, where following instructions from, say, emergency responders can be crucial for safety.
It's interesting how the type of norm also seems to influence how much pressure we feel to conform. Going against a minor social custom is different from violating a deeply held moral belief, right?
Precisely. The social pressure you feel and the level of conformity expected to sort of regain acceptance after a transgression.
What you have to do to get back in the group's good graces.
Exactly. That likely varies depending on whether you violated a folkway, a more, or even a taboo.
A minor social faux pas might just need an apology.
Might just require a quick apology or explanation. whereas violating a more might necessitate a more significant demonstration of aligning with group values to be accepted again.
And for core societal values, maybe even internalization is expected.
For core values, often embedded in mores and laws, there might even be an expectation of deeper internalization, a true recommitment to the norm.
So social norms are clearly very powerful, essential even, but they can't be entirely positive, right? The article discusses the dual nature of norms. Let's explore some of the downsides.
You're right, it's a double-edged sword.
Whoa.
While they are essential for social order and making life predictable,
Which is a huge benefit.
a huge benefit, yes, but norms also have a less beneficial side. One major issue is their role in creating and maintaining prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination.
How do we do that?
Norms can establish and perpetuate biases against certain groups, outgroups. This can lead to negative feelings, prejudice, generalized beliefs, stereotypes, and discriminatory actions, behavioral bias.
And when these get embedded in institutions.
When these become ingrained in our institutions, like in hiring practices or housing or the legal system, it creates systemic or institutional discrimination.
Yeah.
This creates cycles of disadvantage with really significant negative effects for those targeted.
Affecting health, well-being, inclusion.
Absolutely. It can impact health outcomes, life satisfaction, feelings of isolation, economic opportunities. The list goes on.
And what about social progress? Can norms actually hinder positive change?
Definitely. Harmful norms, such as those that have historically limited opportunities based on gender, race, or other characteristics.
Or things like child marriage or child labor in some contexts.
Exactly. Those kinds of harmful traditional practices can be incredibly resistant to change because they're deeply embedded norms. They often reflect and reinforce existing power structures.
And just giving people information isn't enough.
Often, no. Simply providing factual information isn't always sufficient to change these deeply rooted norms. Addressing the underlying structural factors and the social networks that uphold the norm is often necessary for real change to occur.
That makes sense. It's not just about a lack of awareness, it's often about deeply embedded social systems. The article also mentions something called pluralistic ignorance. That sounds intriguing.
It is a fascinating concept.
Mm-hmm.
This happens when many people in a group privately disagree with a norm.
So secretly they don't like it.
Right. But they publicly conform because they incorrectly believe that most other people accept it.
So everyone thinks they're the only one who disagrees.
Pretty much. This mistaken perception of consensus allows unpopular or even harmful norms to persist because individuals are afraid to be the only one, or one of the few, to voice their true doubts or objections.
Like the emperor's new clothes, almost.
That's a great analogy. Think about a company policy everyone secretly dislikes but publicly goes along with, assuming everyone else is on board. That's pluralistic ignorance.
So we all secretly think one thing, but act like we believe the opposite because we think everyone else does. That's wild.
Exactly. It highlights the powerful gap between our private attitudes and our public behavior, and it's a key reason why undesirable norms can be so persistent.
So revealing the true disagreement could shift things.
Finding safe ways to reveal the actual extent of private disagreement can be a powerful tool for shifting these norms, yes.
What are some other negative consequences of social norms mentioned?
Well, the pressure to conform can lead to what the article calls conformity costs,
Meaning?
where we engage in harmful actions or perhaps fail to take beneficial actions simply to fit in with the group. Think of risky behaviors in peer groups.
Okay.
This pressure can also be exploited by others, salespeople leveraging social expectations, for example. We've already touched on groupthink.
Right. Flawed decision-making.
And strong internalization of norms, while often good, can sometimes make us resistant to adapting to new situations or changing circumstances. Behavioral inflexibility.
And normalization of deviance.
Yes, that's where small deviations from important standards or safety procedures gradually become accepted practice over time.
So the standard slips.
The standard slips, leading to a new, lower standard norm that maintains predictability but carries higher risks. Think about safety shortcuts becoming common practice.
It's a real balancing act, isn't it? Norms are essential, we need them, but they also come with these potential downsides. Now, the good news is that norms aren't fixed. The article discusses how they evolve. What are the main drivers of this change?
That's right. They are dynamic, constantly in flux, though sometimes change is slow. Social norms change through a combination of broad societal forces, individual actions, what we call human agency, and, importantly, advancements in technology.
So large-scale social change affects norms.
Yes, social change itself. Alterations in social structures, cultural symbols, value systems can be prompted by things like contact with other societies.
Cultural fusion.
Right. Changes in our environment or ecosystem, technological innovations, shifts in population demographics, and various social, ideological, economic, or political movements.
And how do these large-scale changes actually lead to shifts in our everyday norms? Theories exist, right?
Yes. Various theories try to explain it. Evolutionary models, functionalism sees slow change. Conflict theory sees change driven by struggle. But one crucial way norms change in practice is through social movements.
The social movements.
These are purposeful, organized groups striving for a common social goal, whether it's creating change, resisting change, or giving voice to marginalized groups. They often act as norm entrepreneurs.
Norm entrepreneurs. I like that.
They actively work to establish new norms, challenge existing ones, denormalize the status quo, and raise awareness about specific issues.
Can you give examples?
Think about historical movements, like the abolitionist movement working to denormalize slavery, or the civil rights movement promoting racial equality.
Or more recently. Yeah.
More recently, climate movements pushing for sustainability norms, or movements like the Arab Spring or Occupy Wall Street challenging political and economic norms.
So these movements are actively shaping what we come to see as normal and acceptable. How do they do it?
Precisely. They employ various methods, spreading new ideas through social connections, what some call seeding complex contagion, linking their group identity strongly to the proposed new norm.
Using media, mobilizing people.
Using media effectively, mobilizing stakeholders, holding protests. However, they often encounter significant resistance. Changing norms isn't easy.
They need to reach a tipping point.
Often, yes. They need to reach a critical mass of adoption, and that's usually a struggle against the inertia of the old ways. Norm change is often contested.
Technology also seems to play a huge role in changing how we live and interact, which must impact norms.
Absolutely. Technological advancements can fundamentally reshape our lives, often requiring us to develop new norms or making existing ones outdated or irrelevant.
Like the Industrial Revolution.
The Industrial Revolution led to significant changes in norms around work, family life, community structures. Mass production led to norms of standardized goods.
Or the printing press.
The invention of the printing press facilitated the spread of new ideas, boosted literacy, and fueled major religious and political shifts, changing norms around knowledge and authority.
And today, digital tech, social media.
And today, digital technologies and social media are rapidly transforming norms around communication, privacy, information consumption, even how social movements organize and mobilize. It's happening very fast.
It often feels like technology advances faster than our social rules can adapt.
That's very true. Technological change often creates what we can think of as normative vacuums.
Gaps where we don't know the rules.
Exactly. Where we're unsure about the appropriate behavior or what's considered acceptable online etiquette, for example. This can lead to debate and uncertainty until new informal guidelines and sometimes formal laws are eventually established to catch up.
And finally, the article touches on cultural shifts. How do changes in our shared values and symbols relate to the evolution of norms?
Cultural shifts. So changes in our shared symbols, our behaviors, organizations, underlying values are deeply intertwined with how norms evolve. And these shifts are often influenced by social movements and technological changes we just discussed.
Can you give an example?
The way fashion norms have changed over the decades is a great example. It reflects broader shifts in societal values, ideas about status, beauty, gender roles.
Technology and fabrics, maybe? Political statements?
Exactly. Technological innovations in textile production, political ideologies, artistic movements, they all feed into evolving fashion norms. It's constant back and forth.
Between structure and agency.
Between the structures of society, including norms, and the actions of individuals within those structures. It's a continuous feedback loop, creating ongoing normative change.
So it's a really complex interplay of factors that's constantly shaping and reshaping these unseen rules. Now, we know norms are powerful, but we don't always follow them perfectly. Adherence varies, right? What influences how much we stick to these social expectations?
That's right, adherence isn't uniform. It depends on a complex combination of individual factors, situational factors, and cultural context.
Okay, let's break that down. Individual factors.
Things like our personality traits. Some research links traits like agreeableness and conscientiousness to higher conformity.
Self-esteem. Need for approval.
Yes, lower self-esteem is sometimes associated with more conformity, perhaps reflecting a stronger need for belonging. A strong desire for social approval generally increases conformity.
But what if you want to be unique?
That's another factor. The need for uniqueness can lead individuals to actively resist conformity to express their individuality.
Danger.
Age can play a role. Younger individuals, and sometimes older adults, might be more easily influenced in certain contexts. Gender differences appear small and very context-dependent. Some studies suggest men might resist conformity more in public settings, while women might conform more publicly, perhaps to avoid disagreement. But these differences often diminish in private settings.
And how much you identify with the group.
That's a big one. Stronger identification with a particular group generally leads to more conformity to that group's specific norms. You want to be a good group member.
Psychoanalytic ideas too. Superego.
The article mentions a psychoanalytic perspective, suggesting a less developed superego might link to greater deviation, but that's just one viewpoint.
Okay. And what about the situation itself? Surely that makes a big difference.
Absolutely. The clarity and type of the norm are crucial. If a situation is ambiguous and the expected behavior isn't clear, a state sometimes called anomie, it can lead to deviation or even the emergence of new, temporary norms within that context.
Like in a crowd.
Emergent norm theory suggests even in crowds, new norms can arise to guide behavior in uncertain situations. Also, the distinction between what's expected, expectational norms, and what people actually do, behavioral norms, matters, especially for those in high responsibility roles where violating expectations is seen more harshly.
Presence of authority. Sanctions.
The presence of authority figures, as we discussed, elicits strong obedience. And the perceived risk and severity of sanctions, punishment, or disapproval definitely influence adherence, especially to injunctive norms, what you should do.
Public versus private settings again.
Yes, higher conformity is generally observed in public settings compared to private or anonymous ones.
And group characteristics we mentioned earlier.
Group characteristics like size, unanimity, cohesion, and status all influence the pressure to conform within that specific situation.
Even the vibe of the situation. Cooperative versus competitive.
Yes, cooperative settings might facilitate the internalization of cooperative norms, while highly competitive or defective settings could normalize defection or rule bending.
And whose opinion matters most? The reference group.
Adherence often depends heavily on the norms of the group, whose opinions we consider relevant, our reference group.
Yeah.
We might ignore the norms of one group while strictly adhering to those of another.
And that pluralistic ignorance idea comes back.
Yes, misperceiving that others support a norm, even if they don't, increases our own conformity to it.
It sounds like it's not just about who we are as individuals or the situation we're in, but how those interact.
Exactly. It's the dynamic interaction between our individual characteristics of the specific situation. Someone who generally values uniqueness might still conform under intense group pressure. And conversely, some individuals will resist conforming even when the pressure is very high. Person-situation interaction is key.
And what's considered deviant is relative.
Very relative. It depends on the specific norms in play, expectational versus behavioral, and the perspective of the reference group observing the behavior. Public nudity is deviant in most contexts, but not on a nudist beach, for example.
The article also brings in cultural dimensions. How do things like individualism versus collectivism affect our relationship with social norms? This seems crucial.
This is a really important factor influencing adherence. In collectivistic cultures, where group harmony, interdependence, and fitting in are highly valued.
Conformity is seen more positively.
Generally, yes. Conformity is often more valued and more prevalent. Socialization practices in these cultures might emphasize obedience, duty to the group, and maintaining social harmony, sometimes called narrow socialization.
And in individualistic cultures.
In individualistic cultures, there tends to be a higher value placed on personal autonomy, uniqueness, and self-reliance. These cultures are generally more tolerant of deviation from group norms. Socialization might focus more on independence and self-expression, broad socialization.
Do reactions to breaking norms differ too?
Yes. Research suggests that people in collectivistic cultures may sometimes view transgressors of group norms as more immoral, experience more personal discomfort when witnessing violations, and exert stronger social control to encourage conformity.
But underlying needs might be universal.
Basic human needs like belonging and safety likely drive some level of conformity across all cultures. However, our cultural programming significantly shapes how these needs are met and which specific behaviors become normative to achieve group cohesion and safety. Collectivistic cultures might prioritize adherence to group norms more strongly as the primary path to safety and belonging.
It's fascinating to see how these unseen rules operate so differently around the world. The article provides some excellent examples of everyday social conventions that vary across cultures.
Yes, it really drives home the point that norms are socially constructed. Even something as fundamental as how we greet each other.
Handshake, bow, hug, kiss on the cheek.
Exactly. It varies considerably. Customs around politeness, saying please and thank you, tipping practices, even whether burping after a meal is acceptable or rude.
Personal space, eye contact.
Personal space, how close we stand during conversation, the directness of eye contact, even the typical volume of our speech and conversation, all these have cultural nuances.
But the underlying function might be similar.
That's a key insight. Often these seemingly different customs serve similar underlying social functions, like establishing rapport, showing respect, or managing social interactions smoothly. Understanding these underlying functions can be really helpful in navigating different cultural environments and avoiding misunderstandings.
The article also includes a table illustrating variations in public conduct across different regions: Japan, Latin America, Canada, China, India, the Middle East.
Right, and it really highlights just how context-dependent these norms for public behavior are.
Things like punctuality, gift giving.
Absolutely. Behavior that might be considered perfectly normal in one culture could be seen as quite rude or inappropriate in another. Punctuality norms vary widely. Gift-giving protocols can be quite elaborate and specific in some cultures compared to others.
And fashion norms. We touched on this earlier, but the article discusses how our clothing choices reflect deeper societal values and even power structures.
Exactly. Fashion is such a visible manifestation of norms, from the sumptuary laws regulating dress in historical periods to the constantly changing trends of today.
It reflects status, gender, morality.
It reflects norms around social status, gender identity, ideas of modesty, religious observance, political affiliations, technological capabilities. And then you have culturally specific garments like certain Islamic coverings or West African textiles like kente cloth or the dashiki that carry deep symbolic meaning and are tied to specific cultural norms and identities.
It really highlights how deeply connected our social norms are to our cultural identities and histories. Even in something like moral decision-making, what's considered a moral issue versus just a matter of social convention can vary culturally, right?
It certainly can. While there's debate about universal moral principles versus cultural relativism, the line between social conventional norms, like rules of etiquette, and moral norms, related to harm, fairness, rights, can be drawn differently across cultures.
Collectivistic cultures might see conventional transgressions as more immoral sometimes.
Some research suggests that, yes, because maintaining social harmony is so central, breaches of social convention might be viewed as having a more serious moral dimension than they might in a highly individualistic culture. And our choices in areas like environmental responsibility, family obligations, charitable giving, even obeying questionable orders, these are often heavily shaped by the prevailing social and moral norms around us.
And norms around gender and family are huge areas of cultural variation, too.
Absolutely. Gender norms, societal expectations for how men, women, transgender, and nonconforming individuals should dress, behave, what roles they should occupy, even pronoun usage vary enormously and are undergoing significant change in many places. Family norms about politeness, respect for elders, privacy, household chores, traditions also show vast cultural diversity.
It really underscores just how adaptable human societies are.
Precisely. The sheer diversity of social norms across different cultures and throughout history speaks to our remarkable ability as humans to create and adapt these unseen rules to suit an incredibly wide range of social, environmental, and historical contexts.
We've covered a lot about what social norms are, how we learn them, why we follow them, and how they change and vary. Now, let's delve a bit deeper into the why from a theoretical standpoint. The article introduces some different perspectives. Let's start with functionalism. What's their take on norms?
Functionalism, looking at the big picture, the macro level views society as a complex system whose parts work together to promote stability and solidarity.
So like a body with different organs.
Kind of, yes. From this viewpoint, social norms are absolutely vital. They're seen as crucial for the smooth functioning and survival of society.
How so?
They provide predictable guidelines for behavior, create social order, reduce uncertainty, and foster social cohesion through shared expectations and values. Institutions like family, education, religion, the legal system, they're all seen as functioning to support this stability, and norms are the rules that make that possible.
And socialization fits in how?
Socialization integrates individuals into society by teaching them these shared norms and values, leading to consensus. Functionalism tends to favor slow, gradual change and can even suggest that things we might see as negative, like certain forms of deviance, can have unintended positive functions, latent functions like reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable behavior for everyone else.
So, in the eyes of functionalism, norms are like the essential building blocks, the glue holding society together and keeping it running smoothly.
That's a very good way to put it. They emphasize shared norms for maintaining social order, predictability, and a collective sense of identity. Essential infrastructure, almost.
Okay, now what about conflict theory? Their perspective often presents a very different picture, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Conflict theory, also a macro-level perspective, views society not as harmonious, but as characterized by inequality and ongoing conflict between different groups competing for scarce resources and power.
So, less about stability, more about struggle.
Exactly. From this standpoint, social norms are often seen quite differently. They're viewed as being created and maintained by dominant groups within society, those with more power and resources, primarily to protect their own advantages and privileges.
Often at the expense of others.
Often at the expense of less powerful groups, yes. So norms can be seen as tools that reinforce existing inequalities based on things like social class, race, gender, or other factors.
How do they see socialization then?
Socialization from this viewpoint can be seen as a process of transmitting the ideologies and norms of these dominant groups, getting subordinate groups to accept the status quo. However, conflict theory also recognizes that socialization and institutions can be sites of resistance and struggle.
So they advocate for change.
Conflict theorists generally advocate for significant social change by challenging the norms and structures that perpetuate inequality and injustice.
So instead of being the glue, norms are viewed more like tools of power, instruments of oppression, or reflections of inequality.
Exactly. That's a central theme. They see norms as reflecting and reinforcing the existing power imbalances and social conflicts within society.
Okay, moving from the big picture to the individual level, we have symbolic interactionism. How do they approach understanding social norms?
Symbolic interactionism shifts the focus to the micro level, to our everyday interactions, and how we create and interpret meaning through symbols like language and gestures.
So it's about face-to-face stuff.
Primarily, yes. They view norms not as fixed rules imposed from above by society's structures, but as something that emerges dynamically from our ongoing social interactions.
So norms are socially constructed in the moment.
Exactly. They're seen as socially constructed, fluid, and subject to negotiation and change as our shared understandings evolve through interaction. Individuals are viewed as active participants in shaping and navigating norms in their daily lives.
And socialization from this perspective.
Socialization, from this perspective, is fundamentally about learning these shared meanings and symbols that allow us to interact effectively. Thinkers like George Herbert Mead highlighted how we develop our sense of self by learning to take the role of the other, understanding social expectations, and internalizing them through interaction.
So norms are more like a constantly evolving script that we're all collectively writing and rewriting through our interactions. Less rigid.
Precisely. They emphasize the ongoing creation, interpretation, and negotiation of norms through our daily face-to-face interactions, guidelines rather than rigid rules.
Finally, let's talk about social learning theory. The article mentions it bridges the gap between individual learning and societal norms, right? What's their take?
Yes, social learning theory, most famously associated with Albert Bandura, bridges the micro and macro levels to some extent. It proposes that we learn social behaviors, including norms, primarily by observing others, this is the concept of modeling, and by seeing the consequences of their behavior, reinforcement or punishment.
So we learn by watching.
We learn by watching, yes. But it's not just passive imitation. This learning happens within a social context, and Bandura emphasized a reciprocal interaction between our cognitive processes, our thoughts and expectations, our behavior, and our surrounding environment.
What are the key mechanisms?
Key mechanisms include observational learning, which involves paying attention to the modeled behavior, retaining it in memory, being able to reproduce it, and being motivated to do so.
Motivation based on consequences.
Often based on whether we see the model being rewarded or punished for that behavior that's vicarious reinforcement or punishment. Imitation of role models or those seen as successful is common. Direct reinforcement, rewards and punishments for our own actions, also plays a role. Identification with the model enhances learning too.
So this explains how we learn to conform, but also how we might learn deviant behavior.
Exactly. It helps explain how individuals learn both behaviors that conform to prevailing norms and those that deviate from them, based on the models and consequences they observe in their social environment.
And how does it link to societal norms?
Because we are exposed to these models and consequences constantly, through family, peers, school, and especially through mass media, this individual learning process scales up. It provides a powerful mechanism through which social norms are transmitted, learned, and maintained across society.
So we're constantly looking to others, consciously or not, as a guide for what's considered normal and acceptable behavior, and learning from their experiences.
Yes, we learn by observing what others do and what the outcomes of those actions are. This provides a powerful psychological mechanism through which social norms shape individual behavior and are sustained within a culture.
It's really interesting how these different theories, functionalism, conflict, interactionism, social learning, offer such distinct perspectives on something so central to our social lives. It highlights that there isn't just one single right way to understand the power and function of social norms.
That's exactly right. Each theory provides a different but potentially complementary and valuable lens through which we can examine social norms. Functionalism highlights their role in order. Conflict theory exposes their connection to power and inequality. Interactionism illuminates their creation in everyday life, and social learning explains the mechanisms of transmission. Our understanding is definitely enriched by considering these multiple perspectives.
And whether we view a particular norm as problematic often depends on which theoretical lens we're using, doesn't it?
Absolutely. What might be seen as functional for maintaining social order from a functionalist perspective, like norms differentiating roles, could be viewed as a tool of oppression perpetuating inequality from a conflict theory perspective, or a source of potential misunderstanding and miscommunication from an interactionist viewpoint if meanings aren't shared. The definition of problematic is theory-dependent.
This has been a truly illuminating deep dive into the world of social norms, just fascinating stuff. To bring things to a close, what are some of the key takeaways that we should really keep in mind from all this?
Well, I think the first thing is just how incredibly influential and widespread these forces are. Social norms shape so much of our behavior, often, as we said, without our conscious awareness.
These unseen architects.
Exactly. We've explored how we learn them through socialization, the different types from folkways to laws reflecting societal values, and the different ways we align our behavior compliance, identification, and that deep internalization.
And crucial to remember their dual nature.
Absolutely. Essential for social order, predictability, cooperation, reducing cognitive load, creating belonging. But also potential sources of prejudice, discrimination, barriers to progress, groupthink, and stifling dissent through things like pluralistic ignorance.
And they're not static.
Definitely not static.
Yeah.
They're constantly evolving due to social movements, acting as norm entrepreneurs, technological advancements, creating new contexts, and broader cultural shifts. And of course, they vary significantly across different cultures and throughout history, influenced by individual, situational, and cultural factors.
And perhaps the really important point for listeners is to become more aware of these often invisible architects shaping our own lives.
Exactly. The call, really, is to move beyond simply passive acceptance or unthinking conformity, to actively consider the norms that influence our thoughts and actions.
It's about conscious navigation.
Consciously navigating this social landscape, recognizing when conformity is appropriate or necessary, when it might be okay or even beneficial to deviate, and importantly, when we should challenge norms that are harmful, unjust, or outdated.
Because we do have agency.
While these norms are powerful structures, we as individuals, and especially collectively, have agency, critical thinking, our desire for individuality that some possess, and crucially, the collective power of social movements all demonstrate our ability to influence and ultimately change social norms. We aren't just puppets.
So it's not just about understanding the rules, but also about recognizing our own role, potentially, in shaping them, for better or worse.
Precisely. There's an ethical dimension here too, I think. A responsibility to continuously evaluate the norms around us in terms of their fairness, their equity, their consequences.
And looking ahead.
Looking ahead in an increasingly globalized, interconnected, and technologically advanced world, we will likely see even more complex and rapidly changing norms. This presents challenges potential for norm conflicts between cultures or generations, but also opportunities for greater intercultural understanding and maybe even deliberate norm engineering to address shared global challenges like climate change or public health crises.
That's a powerful thought to end on. So for you, the listener, as you go through your day today or tomorrow, perhaps take a moment to reflect on a social norm you usually follow without giving it much thought. Now that you've joined us for this deep dive, consider why that norm exists. Who does it benefit? Who might it disadvantage? Does it truly serve a positive purpose today? It might just open your eyes a little wider to the subtle yet powerful forces that shape the world around us and our place within it.